Greetings. Now we are still between the wedding at Cana and Jesus' first pilgrimage to Jerusalem at Passover, which will be important because then after that he'll officially start calling the 12 apostles, but he hasn't really done that on an official basis yet. So we are Friday, February 17th, 30 AD, Shabbat the 26th. Chisloth was a Levitical city made over by the tribe of Zebulun to the Levites of the race of Merari. The most celebrated school of the whole country was here. It was very large, and all its exercises were conducted with solemnity. When on the Sabbath Jesus taught in the synagogue, the priests assisted at the discourse. They handed him the rolls of Scripture or read the passages that he indicated, upon which he questioned and explained. There was also singing, but not of the Pharisaical kind. I heard the voice of Jesus sweetly sounding among all the others, but I do not remember having heard him singing alone. Next morning, Jesus taught in the school of Chisloth. Andrew instructed the children in an adjacent hall and recounted to the strangers crowding in all that he had seen and heard of Jesus. Jesus took for his subject vanity and presumption. He performed no cures that day because, as he said, they thought themselves better than others and attributed to their own merit his coming to teach in their city, whereas he would have them know that he had been led thereto by his knowledge of their misery and his desire to humble and convert them. The preaching ended. Jesus went out into the court in front of the synagogue, in which there were little cells belonging to it. They were like sentry boxes in a courtyard. Here he cured of convulsions and other ills numerous children brought to him by their mothers. He cured them because they were innocent. He cured several women also who humbled themselves before him, saying, "Lord, hearken to my fault, my transgression." They cast themselves down in the hall before him and bewailed their sins. Among them were some afflicted with an issue of blood, and others tormented by evil inclinations from which they implored to be freed. That evening Jesus celebrated the Sabbath in the school and afterward ate at the inn. His future apostles and intimate friends were with him at the same table, and the disciples not engaged in serving were in adjoining apartments. Saturday. The next day he celebrated the Sabbath in the synagogue, and in front of it healed many sick. He also visited and cured in their homes many that could not be carried to him. The disciples assisted Jesus in this, bringing the sick, leading them to him, raising them up, and making room for them. They executed his commissions and delivered his messages. All the traveling expenses, as well as the alms, were up to the present furnished by Lazarus, and Simeon's son Obed kept the accounts. The little cells before the synagogue that looked like sentry boxes were in the courtyard where, through a grating, the women spoke in private to Jesus. It was the custom for female sinners, penitents, or women that had contracted legal impurity to receive in those cells consolation from the priests. There was no city upon Mount Tabor, but there were bulwarks, walls, something like a vacant fortress whither at times the troops retired. On the evening after the Sabbath, Jesus and his most intimate disciples, the future apostles, were entertained by a Pharisee who had been touched and converted by the teaching of Jesus. Sunday. Next day, Jesus with his disciples was present at a great banquet given in his honor in the public feast hall by the most distinguished men of the place. Jesus taught here also, and on the same evening left the city for Jezreel, which was not much more than 3 hours' distance from Tabor. Monday. In Jezreel, Jesus' relatives and the disciples from Bethsaida, including Andrew and Nathanael, took leave of him in order to visit their homes. He indicated to them where they should again meet. About 15 of the younger disciples still remained with him while he taught here and performed some cures. There were all kinds of religious and secular schools in Jezreel, for it was a large city. Jesus took Naboth's vineyard for the subject of one of his discourses. And the reference here is 1 Kings 21. Tuesday, February 21st. We are the last day of Shabbat. From Jezreel, by the way, it's Shabbat 30th. From Jezreel, Jesus went 1 hour and a half southward to a field in a valley 2 hours long and as many broad, wherein were numerous orchards surrounded by low hedges. It was an uncommonly productive and charming fruit region. There were numerous tents here standing in couples at different intervals and occupied by people from Shunem who guarded and gathered in the fruit. I think it was a kind of service that they were obliged to take turns in rendering. About 4 occupied one tent. The women dwelt together apart from the men, for whom they did the cooking. Jesus instructed these people under a tent. There were here most beautiful springs and abundant streams, which flowed into the Jordan. The principal source came from Jezreel. It formed in the valley a charming spring, over which a kind of chapel was built. From the spring house, the stream divided into several others throughout the valley, united with other waters, and at last emptied into the Jordan. There were about 30 custodians whom Jesus instructed, the women remaining at some distance. He taught of the slavery of sin from which they should free themselves. They were inexpressibly rejoiced and touched that he had come to them. He was so loving and courteous to these poor people that I had to shed tears myself over it. They set before Jesus and the disciples fruit, of which they ate. In some parts of the valley the fruit was already ripe, in others the trees were only in blossom. There were some brown fruits like figs, but growing in clusters like grapes, also yellow plants from which they prepared a kind of pap. In this valley rises Mount Gilboa, and here also was Saul slain in battle against the Philistines. Subtext: Jesus in Shunem, Ulama, and Capernaum. In the evening, Jesus went through Jezreel and about 3 hours further to Shunem, an open place on a hill. Some of the disciples had gone on before in order to make arrangements with the landlord of the inn at the entrance of the city. The fertile valley through which Jesus had passed lay to the south of Jezreel. He went through a part of Jezreel without attracting notice, and then turned northward towards Shunem. Near the city, that is, at a distance of 1 to 2 hours, are 2 others, one of which Jesus had passed on his way from Tabor to Jezreel. The inhabitants of Shunem depended upon weaving for their livelihood. They wove narrow edging of twisted silk, plain or interspersed with flowers. Shunem did not lie in the valley of Esdraelon, but rather where the mountains took their rise. And now we are in the month of Adar. So this is February 21/22 to March 21/2230 AD. Wednesday, February 22nd, Adar the 1st. The multitude that here pressed around Jesus was simply astonishing, and it was ever on the increase. The people surrounded him everywhere, cast themselves before him, crying and shouting that a new prophet had arisen, one sent by God. Many were sincere in their acclamations, but others followed through curiosity and shouted merely to swell the noise. The crowd was so dense that it was almost like an insurrection. Because here in Galilee the excitement was daily increasing, Jesus resolved soon to leave it. Shunem was the native city of the beautiful Abishag, who had served David in his old age. Elisha also had an inn here, at which he frequently stopped, and in which he had recalled the dead son of his hostess to life. A vision of the same was vouchsafed me, that I might know the place. The city possessed also a free inn for certain travelers. It had been founded as a memorial of Elisha. I know not, however, whether it was the house that the prophet once occupied, or whether it was another built upon the same site. Jesus taught on this day in the synagogue and visited many of the houses to console and cure the sick. Shunem was built rather irregularly around a hill whose summit overlooked the city. A road led up the hill. The houses upon it decreased in size with the ascent, the highest being mere huts. The top of the hill was crowned by an open space upon which stood a teacher's seat. It was surrounded by palings over which an awning could be stretched for the protection from the sun. Thursday, February 23rd. When Jesus on the morning of the following day started with his disciples for the teacher's chair, the whole place was alive with excitement. They had brought numbers of sick in litters and had placed them all along the road leading up the hill. Jesus ascended through the clamoring multitude, healing as he went. The people had mounted to the roofs, the better to see and hear all that he would do and say. From the teacher's chair on top of the hill, the view was magnificent, stretching off toward Tabor. Jesus inveighed against the pride and presumption of the Shunamites, who, instead of being converted, doing penance, and keeping the commandments of God, broke forth into vain shouts over the prophets that had come upon them, sent from God, for they attributed his coming as an honor due to their own merit, whereas he had come in order to convince them of their sins. About 3 p.m, Jesus left Shunem. Taking a northerly direction, he reached, in about 3 hours, a large and closely built city with a less ancient appearance than Shunem. It was enclosed by walls so broad that trees flourished upon them. The city was called Ulama and was about 5 hours southeast of Tabor. Arbela was about 2 hours to the north. The rough roads of the surrounding mountains were covered with sharp white pebbles, on which account there were made in Ulama numbers of soles to bind as a protection under the feet. The city was built on a mountain, surrounded by other mountains, and in an altogether impassable region. Vines covered those mountains from base to summit. I have seen upon them plants as high as a tree, their tangled branches as thick as one's arm. They produce large pyriform fruits like gourds, and from them flasks are made. Ulama did not appear so old as other cities. Indeed, there was something about it that even made it look unfinished. The inhabitants did not bear the stamp of old Jewish simplicity. They appeared to be aiming at greater culture and refinement. It was as if the Romans or some other nation had formerly sojourned among them. Here as elsewhere, the concourse of people was very great, for they knew that Jesus was about to celebrate the Sabbath in Ulama. Several of the disciples had rejoined Jesus, among them Peter's half-brother Jonathan and the sons of the widows. They numbered in all 20. Peter, Andrew, John, James the Less, Nathanael Chancellor, and Nathanael the bridegroom had also come. Jesus had directed them to do so that they might hear his instructions and assist him in his ministrations to the sick, rendered difficult by the turbulence of the multitude. The people had formed out the way by which Jesus was to come, and they went forth to welcome him, carrying green branches and strewing leaves. They had stretched across the road long strips of stuff, which they lowered for him to step over, while shouts of joy proclaimed the advent of the prophet. The chief officers of the place maintained order and formally saluted Jesus in the name of the city. There were in Ulama many possessed who clamored violently after Jesus and shouted his name, but he commanded them to be silent. Even at the inn they allowed him no rest. They ran about raging and screaming until he again ordered them to be silent and had them removed. Ulama had 3 schools, one of jurisprudence, another for use, and the third the synagogue. Friday. Jesus entered different houses to cure and to console. Then he taught in the schools, speaking especially upon simplicity and of the respect due to parents. For in both of these particulars the people of this place were wanting. He rebuked them severely also for their pride, vain at the thought of a prophet's coming upon them. And among them, they were by their presumption depriving themselves of the benefits attached to these days of penance and instruction. Saturday. The Sabbath over, the distinguished men of the place gave Jesus an entertainment in the grand public hall. The apostles and disciples that had gone home limited themselves to a mere visit to their relatives. They had then called upon Mary, with whom the holy women were becoming more and more intimate. The Baptist was still in the same place, his followers constantly diminishing. Herod had several times been to see him and had frequently sent his officers for the same purpose. Sunday, February 26th, Adar the 5th. At 9 o'clock in the morning, after the Sabbath, Jesus went with his disciples to a mountain along which was a pleasure garden or bathing place about a quarter of an hour from the city. The garden was almost as large as the cemetery of Dulman. And this is, they have in brackets, Anne Catherine's home village. It had pavilions and little summer houses, a beautiful fountain, and a place for instruction. Jesus had directed the sick, of whom there were numbers, to be transported thither from the city, for he could not, on account of the crowd, cure in the latter place. The disciples busied themselves in the maintenance of order, and the sick on their litters were placed around the tents and in the pavilions. The crowds that followed from the city were so great that many could not reach the garden. The magistrates and priests also kept order. Jesus passed from litter to litter, curing many. When I say many, I generally mean about 30. When I say a few or several, I mean about 10. Jesus taught and alluded to the death of Moses, whose anniversary would soon be celebrated by a fast day, when their food already cooked would be placed under the ashes, and when they would eat, as usual on such days, a particular kind of bread. He also referred to the promised land and its fertility, which was to be understood not only of its material sustenance of the body, but also of the spiritual nourishment of the soul, for it was also fruitful in prophets and oracles from God, the fruit of which would be penance and the salvation promised to all that would embrace it. The instruction ended. I saw Jesus going into a building nearby wherein the possessed had been assembled. He entered to find them raging and shouting. There were for the most part young people, some of them only children. Jesus caused them to be placed in a row, commanded silence, and with one word, freed them from the evil spirit. Some of them fell fainting. Their parents and friends were present, and to all Jesus addressed some words of exhortation and instruction. And I will conclude the reading here. One of these days, I'll finish a reading and I won't have any notes, but I guess I had some notes this time again. So it's three things again. One is just a brief mention of Abishag, flattering name, I know. I'm not sure a hard G should have any part of a woman's name, but anyway, David was basically on his deathbed, and they gave him a pretty maiden to tend after him. I really don't know why they did this, but they did. I can't go into the mentality of people of over 2,000 years ago. The Shunem is where she's from. Wonderful that your city's claim to fame is having supplied an old king a virgin to make him smile. So anyways, the main note of this is Jesus encounters an interesting attitude among the Shunamites. Because of Jesus' prestige as a prophet already just 3 months after his baptism and his ministry barely having started, they were not there to become corrected of their errors, but rather to see a rock star perform. This attitude is one we're familiar with, especially in our times. Now, we have recently seen elected a new pontiff, Pope Leo XIV, and it'll be interesting to see how he approaches the task of visiting other countries. I think the most rock star pope we've had, perhaps ever, but at least in the last century, was John Paul II. Now, he's very popular. People just they rush to make him a saint because of his sheer popularity. But Malachy Martin had some things to say about this, and we find this kind of what Jesus is encountering here. Now, because Pope John Paul II was so popular, he drew large crowds for his speeches. The problem with this is a lot of his speeches were more of a geopolitical nature than they were of a pastoral nature. You can't help it. When you get sucked into the cares of the world, you end up stuck. I'll get into that. Now, Jesus recognizes this in the Shunamites, as if he's come to elevate their cause and honor them, when really he's come to be a pastor to correct them. But they didn't want a pastor. They wanted a rock show with healings and miracles, like he was the amazing Kreskin or David Copperfield or some traveling circus show. Now, when the Pope travels, whoever the Pope may be, they always have to be conscious of this effect. I remember that in reading one of Malachy Martin's books, Father Malachy Martin, The Keys of This Blood, I think. He talked about John Paul II a lot. Well, that's basically the centerpiece, the center focus of his book. And how John Paul II's discourses were sometimes very welcome. For example, he stood in the face of communism, and he was a very courageous pope, right? So he helped loosen the Iron Curtain over Eastern Europe with his fame, with his office, with his efforts. And he dared to stand up to governments. But, and this is a huge but, on the other side of that, he was sometimes caught in the middle of political rivalries, and some of them wanted to use the Pope, the office of the Pope, as a prop for their own cause, which is a huge problem the Jesuits are having in our times, where the Jesuits want to use God or the Catholic Church or our history as a prop for some socio-political cause, which is well beneath its office. Now, as Malachy Martin would put it, they have a Judas complex, where they'd use a great office, such as the papacy, as a prop for political or social effect rather than to express the mystery of the gospel to the world. And he explained this. Now, I mean, this is one of the main concerns nowadays, because the American left and the American right, I mean, we have an American Pope, so you know that they're going to be dragged into this, or they're going to try to drag him into this. They kind of already are by interviewing his brother. But they're going to play tug of war over the current pontiff. And he has to rise above this nonsense, because he serves an office that is a lot higher than politics. Now, rock star fame that comes with the office, or the vanity that comes from it, will have an effect on everyone who has it, which is why it is such a dangerous thing to possess, the scepter of power. And here Jesus tells the Shunamites, so to speak, I'm not your dancing clown. Buck up. I'm here to call you to repentance, and you guys are treating me like a circus show. There's a lot of Judases that needed to hear it nowadays, especially among the Jesuits, but certainly among many offices or many faculties of the church, many sects. And this is why people always have to take care to elect, the cardinals always have to take care to elect a pope that is exceedingly humble in truth and in spirit, not just expressing humility as a facade and doing a disservice to the office he possesses. That is, you can't make the Pope famous for the sake of wanting to be more rhetorical. You can't use the office in that way. Instead, you just have to hold the scepter while you play the role as you would imagine Christ wants you to play it, without any interference from the world whatsoever. That means you do have to regale yourself in the office, because the office deserves the regalia. But the regalia is not popularity. They are two very different things. The regalia is supposed to express the glory of God on the office. And this is, I do not admire anyone who is a pope, because it is such a hard thing to balance. Now, relating to that note, he preaches later on about Moses and how the promised land is not just something to coddle people. Now, I always say that comfort is the enemy of progress. When one is sated, they may start in a state of gratitude and simply enjoy life. But if they are constantly sated, they no longer feel the pangs of hunger, the discomfort, begging change. So we as Catholics, we celebrate Lent for this reason. The Jews had the festival of booths to remind them where they came from. The Passover to the same effect. And in the festival of booths, they slept in tents in commemoration of the days their ancestors had spent wandering the wilderness, so that they are always in the state of gratefulness over what God has given them. We see this as one of the messages in Mystical City of God that Mary teaches, Mary of Agreda, that you should give thanks every day and be thankful for everything that you have, because God has given all of it to you. So Jesus instructs about Moses and the promised land, and people who are shallow, they want the material that comes from it, because they're like crying babies. And when you give them their soother, then they just go fast asleep. And this is not what we want. So just like when you're engaging in political discussions, people will complain and complain like crying babies until they're made comfortable, till you stick the pacifier in their mouth, and then they're just sort of sedated while the situation gets worse, and they don't even know about it, which is often the case with corrupt political leadership. They sedate their audience with assurances and comforts, while with their other hands are doing deeds of extreme corruption. So in our times, we're so sedated by our comforts provided to us by this technological world we built that many of us have fallen away from the church and its liturgical calendar and its practices. And this was something that Our Lady of La Salette lamented. She made this funny line. I'll never forget it. She said during Lent, after church, they go to the meat market like dogs. They weren't celebrating Lent whatsoever. They were in the material comforts of the Industrial Revolution. And this is always a lamentable consequence, because we owe so much to God, but we are so sedated by our comforts that we aren't aware of how much we owe. So that's it. Ave Maria.